No, stay.
Okay.
Todd, if I remember correctly, at that
Good
dinner-
morning, everybody. Welcome to welcome to Congregation Mikveh Israel, as we are interviewing a wonderful person, a member of the Georgia community. This is Todd Young. And Todd, I'm going to introduce him in a second, but you'll see that other people are on here as well. We're inviting people to come on to either YouTube if they just want to watch, or they can come into Zoom if they want to ask questions. So we give the option. Obviously, we usually have more on YouTube, but if you want to come in on Zoom and ask questions and meet Todd personally, that's a wonderful thing. And it's really quite impressive what he's done. It's a pleasure. This is part of our monthly speaker series that we started actually last month and had a wonderful speaker from Israel. This week we have someone from Aipac. Todd, not coincidentally, lives in Atlanta. And so we're going to first learn a little bit about him. So this, everyone, you can see, is Todd Young. And as we go through, I'm going to be welcoming people in. Todd is a member, obviously, of Aipac. We'll talk to you about that in a second. He served as Director of Campus and Educational Initiatives at the David Project. So if you've heard of that, that's a wonderful, wonderful organization. Then before joining the David Project, he worked for the Raleigh Cary Jewish Federation in North Carolina, where he served as both the director of the Jewish Community Relations Council and editor of the Federation News. He previously served as the communication manager for the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs in DC. He received his MA in International Studies from North Carolina State University and his BA in International Affairs from the George Washington University, originally from St. Louis. He now lives near Atlanta with his wife and 3 daughters. And especially interesting for baseball fans, he's a passionate Cardinals fan who believes that rock music starts and ends with Bruce Springsteen, which not everybody may agree, but everybody appreciates. So welcome, Todd.
I'll take
Again,
that. I'll take that. Thank you.
We've got people coming in, and again, we'll have people signing in on YouTube, and I have my phone here in case anybody calls me and is having any issues. So what we're going to talk a little bit today is something a little different than what I like a lot of people talk about when they talk about Israel. It's often about the process of peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but we're going a different direction this week. We're going to talk about something that should be front page newsworthy, but has been put to the back pages. I don't think it's anything against Israel, maybe a little bit, but also because of COVID and the elections and all the other things going on, the peace process between Israel and a number of Muslim countries has been put to the back pages. It is one of the most important things Israel has entered into in its existence, and it's not even making the news. So we're going to learn a little bit about Aipac. He's talking a little bit about incoming Congress and the Senate, and talk a little about American support for Israel, but then also talk a little bit about peace process. So welcome, Todd.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. I appreciate you you inviting me to be part of the conversation, and it's nice to see some familiar faces and really just engage in a nice conversation on the Shabbat. So thank you.
And what's your official job position now?
So my official position is Synagogue Initiative Director for the Southeast. And as I said, our office, the Southeast office for Aipac, is based in Atlanta, but we cover 9 states, everything from Mississippi up through Central Virginia, excluding Florida. So we have a nice chunk of territory, and hopefully once this all passes, I can get back on the road and start visiting some of those places again. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we'd love to have you. So in other words, if you're a member of a synagogue, or you want any synagogue program, or then it goes through Todd. He also does a bunch of other things, but that's what we work with him with. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start off with Todd. I'm going to ask some questions. If you have any questions you want to ask, just raise your hand or send it in the chat. And then when we have a moment, I'll invite you to ask the question, or if you prefer, I'll ask it for you. And we're going to talk for a little while, and again, kind of have a little bit of a conversation. So first thing, what are the key issues that Aipac is working on right now in America and in Israel?
It's a great question. I'm obligated to say this in my Aipac role, that not that anybody is live tweeting today's discussion, but the program is closed to the press and not for attribution. Just as a side note, in case anybody is out there, that just allows us to have a more candid conversation and talk about what's going on. So I'll just give you a brief explanation about Aipac for those who might not be overly familiar. We're the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. So even though the PAC is in our name, we are not a political action committee. We don't give money to candidates. We don't endorse candidates. We don't rate candidates. We're a public affairs committee, and our goal is to educate, inform, to work with elected officials, especially members of Congress, to help them better understand the U.S.-Israel relationship and really to impact policy to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship moving forward. And we can get into much more detail about how we do that. But one of the things to keep in mind about us as well is that we are strictly bipartisan. And I know it's tough to think about anything being bipartisan nowadays, where you can't name a post office without there being acrimony and arguments. But everything that we do, every legislation that we get behind, every resolution that we support or letter from Congress that we support has to be bipartisan. So we have to have both Democrats and Republicans involved. And again, our job is to impact policy to strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship, because we believe it's both instrumental to helping keep Israel safe in what is an ever-changing and often volatile neighborhood. And it also benefits the United States as well. So some of the main issues that we focus on that work with Congress, the top one every year is foreign assistance, is security assistance to Israel, and making sure that foreign aid is passed and that Israel is able to get the assistance and the resources it needs to protect itself by itself. So not asking for any foreign troops or American troops to be there, but really just having the resources to be able to defend its people and its territory. Obviously, Iran is a top issue, and how do we constrain Iran, especially its nuclear program? We work to counter BDS, which is aimed to delegitimize Israel and to really strangle Israel economically. And then there's a range of issues that come up year to year that we work on, again, as a means of making sure Israel is able to thrive in the Middle East. And again, we can go into much greater detail about what we're looking at for this Congress and what we're looking at down the road. But those are the top issues that we've been focusing on.
And before we get into some of the issues with Israel and the other countries, we're just going to touch on the fact that we just finished an election cycle. Of course, this was a very important election, and that there was a switching of power and almost a switching of power in both the Congress and the Senate and in the presidency. It didn't quite get there. So what is your take on what's going on and how we work with the new Congress people, the previous ones, new senators, new president?
It's a great question. And, obviously it was a whirlwind, or it seemed like a whirlwind the last few weeks with everything going on. And especially here in Georgia, we became the center of the political universe for a period of time. As I said, Aipac, our number one focus is on Congress, because we believe that you have the ability to work with members of Congress more effectively, more closely than working with any presidency. And obviously, you can't really work with, it's not, the judicial branch isn't really a place that focuses on our issues. And members of Congress being elected locally, they're more accountable to local constituents. They're up for election, at least in the House, more frequently. And so it's a real ability to build a relationship. And we count on our members across the country, our activists who are involved, to really do the majority of that work and to have those contacts, to be in communication, to be working with officials when things come up. So Congress is our focus in what we do. Our work doesn't begin after Election Day. Our work is happening every day, and especially leading up to elections. Our political team meets with all viable candidates for federal office well before the election to try to establish a relationship, help them understand the organization, help them understand the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship to the United States as well as to Israel. And we often ask them, or we always ask them, to write a position paper, to put their thoughts down on some of the issues that we focus on, from security assistance to Iran to some of the other challenges that exist. And this helps establish those contacts. It helps them understand that there's a constituency out there that cares very deeply about the U.S.-Israel relationship and the security about this and the security of the state of Israel. So this work is going on throughout the year, and obviously very intensely in the weeks and months leading up to election. So after Election Day, we're not starting from scratch. We're not just meeting a candidate or a representative, senator that day or right when they're sworn in. But these contacts, this communication has really been going on for a period of time. So that's just provide a little background in terms of how we operate, how we function. And the one thing I will add is in DC, we have a very small team of lobbyists. When you think of the AARP, when you think of some of the other organizations, the NRA, for example, scores of lobbyists, hundreds of lobbyists that are employed by them. Our professional lobbyist number, I think 10 right now in DC. So the majority of the work that's done and how we accomplish our goals is actually done through all of you and through all of our activists and the people who are reaching out, establishing contacts, keeping members of Congress informed on the local level. That's the majority of the work, and we're so appreciative for everybody who does it because it wouldn't get done without all of you. So this new Congress, we can go into much greater detail. It's obviously been an interesting time in politics. Can't remember how many elections in a row, now, a number of elections in a row, we've had more than 60 new members of Congress elected. And when you're talking about an issue such as this, where institutional knowledge, familiarity with the region, with Israel, with the legislative process is so critical, the high turnover creates a number of challenges. We lose people who are very deeply involved or people we've built relationships with over the years. And so often with a lot of the new elected officials, we're starting from scratch in terms of the education, in terms of the relationship. And you can imagine that if you're running for Congress from, Boise, Idaho, or, Davenport, Iowa, or Knoxville, Tennessee, just to pick on a few cities, you're not trying to get elected based on your position on the U.S.-Israel relationship or what's going on in the Middle East. You're running on local issues, you're running on healthcare, you're running on the economy. So it's not a primary issue, and we have to work to put the U.S.-Israel relationship and issues from the Middle East at the forefront. And that's why it's so critical to have people involved throughout the country, making those contacts, making those calls. So new Congress coming in, there's definitely some new champions, definitely some excellent people, strong voices that have just been elected. And I can tell you about a couple of those. And we also lost a couple of champions, people who have been just fantastic on the U.S.-Israel relationship and just strong ties to the community. So Elliot Engel, who many of you might know, who was the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee for a number of years, representing from New York. He lost in a primary challenge back a few months ago. And so he was somebody that knew the issues front and back, very well connected to the pro-Israel community, understood the challenges Israel faced. I mean, he was a very strong friend to the pro-Israel community. And obviously he was voted out of office. Nita Lowey, who was the former chair of the Appropriations Committee, which is obviously essential when it comes to talking about foreign aid and passing some of those bills. She retired after a number of years. And again, she was somebody who was a staunch supporter of the state of Israel and the relationship between the countries. And so when you lose voices like that, there's a lot of work involved in making sure that the new people understand the situation, have those connections, and are prepared to vote on very serious issues. So I'll pause there for a second. I can go into talk about some of the new people coming in. There's some really bright spots, and we can go from there. Or Rabbi, I'll leave it to you as to where.
Yeah, we may come back to that. I'd like to get into a little bit of the peace process now, because it's so unique and it's something a lot of us haven't really heard any of the nitty-gritty behind. Before we go into what's going on, could you talk a little bit about what's led up to Israel creating these relationships with United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Sudan and Morocco and many other?
So it's an excellent question. And I will tell you, there's still a lot of details that haven't come out yet. And I'm sure it'll take, some time for a lot of documents and a lot of other things to be declassified, some more of the stories to become known. But it really is an incredible, really remarkable achievement. And I'll just add this, it seems like it was an overnight sensation that's years in the making, for lack of a better phrase. And before we get into some of the details, let me just point out the incredible nature of this and why this is so important and something really to celebrate. Israel has had some back channel relationships and communications with a number of these countries for many, many years, but it was never out in the open. It was always kept hush hush. It wasn't something that was brought to the forefront. But with the signing of these accords, it's really a recognition from those countries that Israel is there to stay, that Israel is a permanent member of the Middle East. Israel is going to be a permanent neighbor. Think back how isolated Israel was for a number of years. After the Six-Day War and the Arab League got together and said no negotiation, no recognition, no peace. And now here we are 50 years later, where many of these countries are lining up to work with Israel and collaborate. And this is not a quiet peace. This is out in the open, signed, and you see the benefits of that relationship already occurring. So I just think it's so important to recognize just how monumental this is, and something we should all celebrate as people who care very deeply about Israel. Now, into a little bit of the details. As I said, this is an overnight success, years in the making. Israel and the U.A.E. have actually had back-channel communications and some collaboration going back to the 90s, back when Clinton was president and Rabin was prime minister. And they obviously had some shared concerns in the region. And a lot of the leaders had been talking again, but this was all off the radar. What changed now? I think there's a few factors. And again, we can dive into all of them, but I think there's a sense of there's a real shared interest. And I think a lot of the leaders, especially in the Arab states, are willing to put their self-interest first in a way that maybe they haven't done before. So one of the top issues is Iran, right? Those Sunni Arab states fear Iran. I mean, they may never have loved Israel a lot, but they absolutely fear Iran and what it means. And Iran's support for terrorist groups in the region, its sending of weapons to some of these rogue actors, obviously the pursuit of the nuclear program. And these Sunni states are really worried about what Iran is going to do. And they see in Israel a staunch ally. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. In this case, it might actually be a useful paradigm to view it. So they see in Israel an ally, somebody who's also working to confront Iran, and they feel like with those, with that cooperation, with that collaboration, they have a stronger front, a more united front to counter Iranian ambitions in the region. So that's number one. Number two, you have in some of these, especially in the royal families, a younger crop of leaders and very influential voices in their country now. They weren't around in 1948. Maybe they were just born around 67, but they weren't part of that conflict from the start. So they have a different view as to what's going on in the region. And they have a much more forward-looking view. A lot of them recognize that they can't rely on oil for the rest of their lives to be the sole source of income or the sole source of prosperity for the country. They really need to diversify. They need to create a modern economy based on technology, environmental concerns, all sorts of things that will take them more into the 21st century than where they are now. And they look at Israel and they see a high-tech country that's been able to turn, make the proverbial desert bloom, and can really be a source of inspiration, of innovation. They can work together to share technology, green technology, all sorts of different avenues that they can work together that will help a lot of these Arab states achieve their economic goals. And I think that's one of the main driving forces in doing it. And then also, in some small way, COVID has played a role. And I think as the virus spread around the world, realize it's not contained, and it's going to take collaboration from a number of parties in different countries and scientists everywhere to really stop the spread and prevent further damage. And if you look at Israel, and they've had some great successes in treating, in dealing with it, and some of the scientific developments coming out. And they also see that, there's a way that, again, if we can work with Israel, we can partner with Israel, it's beneficial to us, it's beneficial to the people. And we're going to get a lot more out of working with Israel, partnering with Israel, making peace with Israel, than we will staying in this state of conflict that is really unnecessary. And I'll just add, just from a geographical standpoint, I'll just add a couple points. When you think of especially the U.A.E. and Israel, it's the same distance to Spain from Israel as it is from Israel to the U.A.E. So they're not close neighbors. There was never a territorial dispute between those countries. They're far away, they don't share a border. And so the idea that the conflict had to remain really just seemed anachronistic to the leaders. And now's a chance to be forward-looking and really build on this and capitalize on it.
And before we continue, what countries are we talking about officially, and what countries unofficially are looking will probably be part of the process in the future?
So it's a great question. So the initial accords, or this whole process started with the U.A.E, the United Arab Emirates. Bahrain quickly followed. Remember the signing ceremony, I believe, was in September on the White House lawn. And then there were moves followed that by both Sudan and Morocco. And obviously Sudan is quite an interesting story. They have a long history of troubled leadership, hosting terrorist groups, and they've really made a turnaround in terms of governance and leadership over the last few years. And now I believe they're off the State Department's list of states that sponsor terrorism. And Morocco is, again, another interesting country. They've actually had a relationship with Israel for a number of years. It was put on pause during some of the conflict and the flare-ups of violence. But again, the communications remained, and Morocco's actually played a pivotal role in some of the Arab-Israeli negotiations over the years, with Israeli leaders visiting Morocco to meet with other Arab leaders. And so that's not too surprising that Morocco came around. They still have a Jewish community there. They had a very strong Jewish community for a number of years, and you still feel that presence when you're in that country. So down the road, it's a good question. I've heard the possibility of Tunisia, which would be an interesting one, especially since you remember back in the 80s and 90s, Tunisia hosting the PLO, and that was the base after they were forced out of Lebanon. So that would be an interesting country to come on board as well. Oman, possibly. Prime Minister Netanyahu met with the leader of Oman in the past couple of years. So there's a number of factors, and I'll just add this one point, just to go a little bit deeper. What this whole process did, I think in many ways, is it got rid of the idea of linkage. And that was the idea that was common in a lot of foreign policy circles, that there will be no peace in the region unless Israel comes up with a solution or a resolution to the Palestinian conflict. That until there's progress with the Palestinians, that the rest of everything else is on hold. And I think this swept that idea aside and say, wait, we can work, Israel can work and build relationships and have peace, a warm peace with a lot of these countries, despite the progress on that front. And again, we can work on that front later on. I think Israel would love to, and I think a lot of countries would love to see that process take shape at some point. But we're not beholden to it. We're not going to be held hostage by what happens on the Palestinian front. We can work on different avenues in the Middle East to build a better future. And I think this really proved that old idea was not very valid anymore. So.
And what about other countries, Malaysia, places with Pakistan, with large, other North African countries, Libya, are those on the table as well?
It's a good question. I've heard that Indonesia is looking to possibly become part of it and get involved in some form of negotiations. And I think, we'll hear more of these down the road, especially when you start seeing the benefits of these relationships that come, economic benefits, technological benefits, partnership on cybersecurity. When a lot of these countries start to say, hey, this is actually proving very beneficial, that there's no reason we shouldn't be collaborating, we shouldn't be cooperating, that you'll see a desire for more countries to come on board. And this is, just add a couple points to this, the peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan that Israel's had for a number of years, remarkable from a strategic standpoint. And obviously Egypt, and having an Arab leader visit Israel, acknowledge Israel, was remarkable at that time for what it did, but it's never translated to a warm peace where you see people working together. We always stayed at a governmental level. What you're seeing now is actually a lot of person-to-person, peer-to-peer, citizen-to-citizen collaboration and involvement. I think there's been 60,000 Israelis who already traveled to Abu Dhabi and traveled to the U.A.E and making business contacts and tourism and exploring that. And so the difference between these series of agreements, the ones in the past, is you'll actually see, I think, a lot more on the ground connection and communication than we did in the past. And I think that's a fantastic step. I mean, and regardless of your political background, where you're from, what happened over the past year is really remarkable in a number of ways. And I think the U.S. can play a role in making this happen. And the more the U.S. can do, and this is something that we might be looking to Congress to look at in the next 12 or 18 months. What role can the United States play in fostering these agreements and helping these partnerships? And support joint collaboration, joint research projects, ways of bringing the countries together, and again, in these areas of environmental technology or in business development. And so we'll be looking to see if there's ways that we can really be a leader in building out these agreements and getting more countries involved.
Are there any questions before we continue? I want to make sure anybody who decided to come on Zoom, and again, this will stay on YouTube for a couple of days after we finish, and then we'll take it off as requested. So I've got a couple of questions. One, Israel, I think, is number 2 after America for amount of time is in the press, which is really quite amazing because Israel is such a tiny country. Why haven't we heard anything about this? Even if you're looking for it, it's hard to find. And I every once in a while you'll see it, but it's just not there.
So it's a great question, and I have a couple ideas, but I'm not a media expert, so these are just my my hypotheses as to what's going on. And first of all, peace may not be as sexy as sadly as sometimes violence and flare-ups can be. So it might not be as attractive as a storyline to many members of the media. But I think a couple of things. I mean, obviously COVID being the number one story here. And first of all, I should have started by saying I hope everybody is healthy and safe and doing well and weathering the storm as well as possible. And so to look forward to getting back to Savannah as soon as it's safe to travel. But with COVID, topping the story, and obviously with the elections in the United States and the turmoil over the past 2 months in the aftermath, I think it's driven some of these achievements and some of these positive stories to the back. And I think that's just a function of the media, what sells, what they're interested in covering. And a deeper level, and this is not our area of expertise or not one that we focus on, but the number of foreign correspondents, number of journalists who used to be based in Israel and based throughout the world has decreased over the years. So I think there's less people that are seeing the story firsthand, and probably even less so now with the virus spreading as much as it did. So I think that's a challenge. But look, it's the more we talk about it, the more we can celebrate it, the more we could embrace these agreements. Hopefully that will drive attention to it, and we can really enjoy the fruits of it.
Jeff, did you have a question? I want to make sure I get you if you did. If not, my question is, what about Europe? Europe has had a tenuous relationship with Israel through the years, and certainly it hasn't been as strong as many had hoped during the past 10, 15, 20 years. Are they changing their view of Israel a bit because of this? Are they ignoring it with all the turmoil going on in Europe? Is it even on their radar at all?
It's a great question. I haven't followed too much from the European press or what's going on in those countries, as they've been going through obviously very challenging times. I mean, we all know Italy and France and Spain have been battling the virus, and obviously in Germany and in Great Britain as well. So I don't think it's been a top issue. I think, at least I hope that they will also get behind these agreements and see it as a positive step for the region and for the world. Anytime you have countries working together to promote prosperity and to engage in diplomacy and engage in these connections, that's something to be celebrated. They're, one of their top issues and something they've been focused on, and I'm generalizing about the European community, has been trying to make progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front. And so I think there'll probably be some pressure coming from them to try to expedite some activity in that realm. And I think also some of the results, some of the maybe tension has to do just with the nature of the governments. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's been in power for a number of years, right-leaning governments, hasn't always had the best of connections with a lot of governments who have tended to lean a little bit left in Europe. But again, I think until COVID passes, there's not going to be much pressure or activity coming from that front. And let me just add to that as well, is the Europeans are also worried about Iran, not in the same realm or same category that Israel and the Sunni Arab states are. In fact, Great Britain, Germany, and France just released a combined statement a few days ago expressing deep concern about Iran's nuclear activities, especially as they've continued to enrich beyond the threshold allowed in the 2015 agreement. So I think that's kind of taken the maybe focus off Israel a little bit.
And we'll go to Larry in a second, but we had a question that came a little bit earlier from Carol. How does the strong split in the American Jewish community in the last election impact AIPAC's strategy and their message to the American Jewish community?
Ooh, that's a great question. And, you know, I'll answer in a couple different ways. As I said, bipartisanship is absolutely critical. It's paramount to the work that we do. We can't maintain the strong support in the long term if we don't have both Democrats and Republicans working together on this issue. And we've been very fortunate so far, though through hard work, that Israel has remained a consensus issue. But it's top concern that if we continue to get polarized, that that consensus may shrink a little bit. So in terms of the Jewish community, and if I don't answer this correctly, please jump in and clarify if I'm not quite getting the full scope of the question. So obviously a split in the Jewish community on a number of issues. When it comes to Israel, it's actually been relatively strong. And this is something that we see for everyone who's been to policy conference in the past, and obviously this year, we unfortunately had to cancel it because of the situation. But we have 18,000 people coming together from around the country, from California to New York, from Texas to Minnesota, and everywhere in between. And people who have strong partisan passions, people who are strong Republicans, people who are proud Democrats. But on this issue, when it comes to the security of Israel, able to come together and set those passions aside on every other issue, to come together to celebrate Israel, to support Israel, to make this issue, again, a consensus issue that that we need it to be to achieve the success that we want. So there are obviously some splinters. There's some groups who obviously have a very different view of us and who have both directions. But for the most part, we've seen that consensus hold. But it takes work. It doesn't happen by chance. It doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen just by hope. It takes obviously the work of rabbis across the country to make sure that the consensus remains, to make sure people understand the importance of the issue. And again, we don't get involved in domestic Israeli issues. So whether or not, when it comes to controversy around the wall or other things, that's not our domain. We're focused on what can we do to ensure that the U.S.-Israel relationship remains strong. And I think that concept and that pillar will remain. And again, if I didn't answer that, or if there's more clarification, please push back and let me know.
And Larry Rosendorf, also from South Carolina, I think you have a question.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Todd. Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, Rabbi, Todd, rather, you had mentioned that, one of the positive things that came out is that these initiatives for recognition have come about without really any, let's say, burden on the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Wasn't there some early language in one of the peace treaty, one of the recognitions about settlements? And I think was with the U.A.E. And also, I was just wondering, with the recent, announcement about a week or so ago of some of the increase in settlements, has that thrown any kind of a wooden shoe, so to speak, into the network? And then I have a second question on something else.
Okay. So great question. Let me try to address it, and then we'll come back for the second one. So if you remember going back about a year ago, there was talk within Israel about annexation, and as part of the Trump peace plan that Israel would be permitted, and again, I don't have the specific language in front of me, to annex some of the territory in the West Bank. And this was going back and forth discussions. Again, a lot of people were upset. Some people were happy. It was quite the hot topic for a period of time. When the U.A.E. agreement came up, part of that, it gave everybody a chance to kind of back down from certain positions and still walk away with something. So the U.A.E. said, look, we can't go forward with it if Israel is going to go ahead and annex the territory. And it was more important to have this agreement to be able to make peace and normalization with another country than it was, I think, within Israel to formally annex a piece of territory. So Israel got the agreement it sought. The U.A.E. could claim that it helped stop Israel from acquiring this territory. And again, I think it was, at least in some ways, a small positive step for the Palestinians who didn't have to worry about Israel making a unilateral move in that realm. So there was, I mean, that was a piece of it. I think a piece of the discussion. It wasn't the sole reason for it. It wasn't the impetus for the agreement, but it played a role in the conversations early on, from what we know. And again, a lot more of this will come out in the coming months and years as more details and more people write books and more people write articles. We'll learn a lot more about what went on behind the scenes. I haven't heard anything about the latest move upsetting that. And again, there may have been some statements, and may have been people in some of those countries upset about what's going on. I haven't heard about it derailing the process. I think there's a lot of wait and see going on. One, we have a new administration coming in. So I think there's a little just hesitancy to make any bold moves in any direction because they want to see where the Biden administration is going to go. And also in Israel, elections again in a few weeks. You know, we joke Israelis love democracy so much they want to try it every few months, and so it's things are going to move a little slowly. And I'll just add one tiny caveat. A lot of times these approvals are given, or these permits are given to build additional houses, but it's months and sometimes years in the process before there's ground broken. There's a series of bureaucratic maneuvers that have to take place. There's generally appeals. And so there really is a long drawn out process from the time that a permit might be given or approval might be stated from the government to where you actually see shovels in the ground.
It just seemed like the timing seemed a little awkward as far as, right on the heels of our inauguration, right on the heels of, announcing some new players into the process that this came about.
I agree. And again, I think you have to look at all of these through Israeli domestic political sense. A lot of the parties are jockeying for position and jockeying for support with the upcoming elections. And so I think you just kind of have to take each of these announcements or each of these moves with that in mind as to how is this going to impact their electoral chances, or how are they thinking that it's going to affect their electoral chances. So I think that's what a lot of it has to do with right now. And again, I think we need some patience to wait and see how it's going to play out, and we'll see if it has an impact.
On another subject, several years ago, I heard another AIPAC speaker, and he said pretty much what you did. That
I'm glad we're consistent then. That's a good.
No, on a different subject, and he said, as far as the role of AIPAC, and he pretty much said, the people in Idaho, they're more interested in how many potatoes can I grow, and subsidies for farmers and things of that nature, and they know very little. And now you have a whole, not a whole new, but a lot of new faces, as you said there. And he said one of the most important things was trying to get many of these new faces over to Israel and invite them on these junkets, if you want to call it that. How do you go about doing that? Do you just send out a blanket invitation and all expenses paid trip, or what is the procedure there?
So that's a great question. So we have a sister foundation, the American Israel Education Foundation, who sponsors trips to Israel for elected officials, especially for senators and members of the House. And we set up the trip for the August following the November election. So we're hoping, and again, so much up in the air based on the vaccine availability and what goes on with the virus. Hopefully there's a chance we can take the new members of Congress to Israel this August. So all freshman members of the House, again, Democrat and Republican, are invited to go on this trip. And usually the caucus leader attends with them. So Steny Hoyer for the Democrats, Kevin McCarthy for the Republicans. And we've gotten about 75% participation over the past couple election cycles of freshman members attending Israel. And our foundation, again, sponsors a trip. And it's an incredible experience for all of them. I'll just, as you said, you're running for office in Idaho or Iowa or Wyoming. You're not necessarily focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict. In fact, you're not focused on foreign policy in general. So we've actually had to help a number of members of Congress just get a passport and get their paperwork in order because this foreign experience isn't part of their political background. And so, again, they're all invited to attend, and the trip over there, it's a very comprehensive and very in-depth look at the region. So they meet with Israeli leaders, but they also meet with Palestinian leaders. They meet with local activists. They meet with Arab-Israeli leaders. They try to get the full gamut as to what's going on. So they come back with a deep understanding. They understand the geography. They understand the complexities. They understand the societal issues. They understand the history of conflict and of peace in the region. And a lot of them will tell you it is one of the most influential trips they've ever taken because of just how in depth it is. And one of the great things about the trip is that for a period of a couple of days, the Republican contingent gets together with the Democratic contingent and they have some meetings together, share some meals together. See, there's not a lot of collaboration going on in Washington right now, but in Israel, they're getting a chance to get to know their colleagues in a less stressful environment, sharing a meal, talking informally, experience this foreign country. And so they come back, again, not just with a deeper understanding, but hopefully a deeper appreciation of how bipartisanship can and should work on critical issues. So what we're going to do this year, again, it's all dependent on the virus and vaccines and Israel allowing people into the country. But our effort to engage and inform and provide avenues for discussion with these new members is ongoing.
Thank you.
Rabbi, I'll let you direct the
I'm
conversation.
gonna make sure if there's anybody else has any questions before I go on to my next question. David Jacobson.
Well, hopefully y'all can hear me.
We got you.
Mr. Todd, I'm not positive that you're going to talk about this later on, or if it's off topic. We have two new senators, and I remember a few weeks ago, I received mailings from both of the senators' campaigns saying how much they're very powerful allies of Israel. And then I've heard another person who wouldn't vote for one of them, saying that he was not going to be a ally of Israel. Could you tell me a little bit about, if you can, what do you think the outcome was of the new senators from Georgia?
Absolutely. So it's a great question. And I know it was on a lot of people's minds in the weeks leading up to January 5th in a very, very contentious manner in some respects. So as I said, our effort or our goal is to meet with all viable candidates for federal office before the election. So we have a relationship, we have a connection, and we can talk with them about their views on the U.S.-Israel relationship and how they view things in the Middle East. So we had great conversations with both candidates at the time, John Ossoff as well as Raphael Warnock. Both authored position papers for us, explaining their view on the U.S.-Israel relationship, expressing strong support for the security assistance, talking about the need to stop Iran's nuclear program. And in fact, I'm happy to send those papers to the rabbi, and if anybody who wants to pass them along, so you can see where they stand. I'll say just add a couple of things. Pastor Warnock actually came to the policy conference this past March when we had it. He's met with some of our top activists in the Atlanta area. He has a great relationship with Rabbi Peter Berg from the Temple in Atlanta. They've talked about these issues. So if you want to go back, I can't go back into everything they've said in the past or what they may have done or written 5-10 years ago. What I can tell you is that both have shown a willingness and showed a willingness throughout the campaign to engage with us, to engage with the pro-Israel community in Atlanta, open to hearing what's going on, to learning about the situation. And their position papers are very much in line with what a lot of other Democratic candidates across the country wrote. So we use that as a basis, the relationships we've established with them moving forward. We hope those people, those activists, continue to stay in touch. And all of you as residents of Georgia, or those that are not joining us from South Carolina today, will also just reach out. And the more they hear from constituents that the U.S.-Israel relationship is a top issue for us, we want to make sure you're working to keep the U.S.-Israel relationship strong. That goes a long way to impact their thinking. After all, they have to stand for election again. So they're going to be aware of what constituents are saying and thinking on this topic. So again, I'm happy to send those papers to the rabbi, and if anybody wants them from there. And look, we'll see how it goes once they start voting and once they're on record in Congress. But again, they've showed a willingness to engage. They put their thoughts and their views on paper, and we're going to use that from basis to keep the relationship going.
Thank you. Rabbi, can I get that paper he's going to send?
Yeah, Todd, would you go ahead and send that to me, and I'll make sure it's available for everyone. It's a good question, David, because it's something probably been on everybody's mind in Georgia for the last 6 to 8 weeks previous to the election. And I know Rabbi Berg sent me a note saying he said the same thing that Todd said when he sent me the note. So hopefully that will be the case. But yeah, it's a great question. We have a question from Carol again. She wanted to mention, are these arrangements between Israel and these other countries in danger if Bibi is defeated in the election and his party loses out?
It's a good question, and I can't speculate about the future. Lord knows I won't try to predict politics in any country, but I doubt it. I mean, these are agreements that are widely hailed across the Israeli political spectrum. And again, understanding Israel for so long had been isolated, countries not willing to work with, engage, partner, acknowledge Israel's very existence in some respects. And now you have this where Israelis are traveling back and forth, business partnerships are taking shape, investments going back and forth. I don't think anyone, I don't see anybody wanting to turn back the clock necessarily. So regardless of who wins, I think the Israeli government will continue to push ahead, try to find ways to cement these relationships and strengthen them moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a good idea. 1 second before Larry, I want people to understand that this is only 5 countries right now, but by far most of the Muslim countries in the world are Sunni, right? So if these major leaders of the Sunni Muslim world, like Saudi Arabia, especially Saudi Arabia, do make these official peace negotiations real and sign peace accords, it could be like a domino knocking over, right?
It could. Look, and you brought up Saudi Arabia, somebody we haven't really brought up before, and everybody's waiting for the giant domino to fall, if you will, as the crown jewel, if you will, when it comes to Saudi Arabia. And I'll tell you, we're not anticipating any significant moves on the Saudi front in the next few months. It's still ruled by a king who's part of the elder generation, who isn't quite ready to make that jump. At the same time, the crown prince is very influential. And none of these other moves would have happened, at least with Bahrain and the U.A.E., if there wasn't at least tacit approval coming from Saudi Arabia. And if the Saudi leaders didn't say, it's okay, go ahead and do it, it's doubtful that those moves would have been made. So I think the Saudis are kind of waiting a little bit to see how it plays out, to see the fruits of these relationships, to see how other countries react, before they, because they recognize their level of prestige in all of this as being the guardians of the holy sites of Islam. So they have a lot at stake and a lot of prestige and power in this. So it might take a little time to get Saudi Arabia there. But again, none of this would have happened with these other countries if there wasn't at least some support behind the scenes from the Saudi royal family.
Thank you. And Larry, I think you had another question.
Well, I think you pretty much answered. I was going to bring up Saudi Arabia, so thank you for.
Sorry about that.
We read your mind. It was a.
But the next other country I was going to ask about was Turkey. Not an Arab country, but certainly a very strong, dominant, Muslim country in the area. Any thoughts there? Put on your crystal ball.
Turkey is a very difficult country to look at right now, and I'll just preface this by saying there's a think tank in DC called FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, who they do an amazing job covering Turkey and explaining what's going on. And so I can provide a quick overview, but if you want to go into greater depth, I'd encourage taking a look at them. So it's interesting with Turkey. Turkey and Israel used to actually have very strong relationships going back a number of years. But the new leader in Turkey, Erdogan, he's not so new anymore, he's been there for a number of years, actually going in a much more authoritarian direction and very anti-Israel. If you remember the flotilla that tried to get into Gaza a few years ago came from Turkey. Turkey has been known to support, or at least provide, different avenues of support for Hamas and other anti-Israel groups. And so the likelihood of there being any rapprochement or détente anytime soon is not very likely. Now, the troubling part, I'd say, with Turkey, and again, we're not going to get too far in the weeds with the relation to Syria and the Kurds and that situation, but at least from an American standpoint, is Turkey acquiring the S-400, the very sophisticated Soviet air defense system. But Turkey is also a member of NATO. And so it's causing a lot of friction, should a NATO ally who has access to a lot of technology and insight into the workings of the alliance, also going after this very sophisticated Soviet equipment technology, it's creating a lot of friction, a lot of problems in terms of the relationship with the United States and Turkey, as well as European countries and Turkey. And so they are, it could be a flashpoint in the coming years as to what happens there.
I think a lot of people are worried about that. All right, excellent. Thank you, Todd. Do you have anything else you'd like to add before we conclude? Especially maybe about what we can do.
Yeah, I was hoping for some Springsteen questions, but I guess we can maybe do that at a later time. Now, again, I'll just conclude with a thank you to you, Rabbi. You've been involved and a leader for us for a number of years, and we appreciate everything that you've done and all the work you've done in the community to bring this issue to the forefront and to be engaged with us. And I'll just add this to everybody: if as Jews, if we are not members of the Jewish community, if we are not making this case to our elected officials, if we are not actively supporting the U.S.-Israel relationship, it's tough to ask our friends in other communities to do it. And so we need to be out there standing with our friends in the Christian community, in the African-American community, the Hispanic community, and really building a wide movement and a wide cohort of people who are committed to this issue. So I hope you'll find a way to be more involved. Again, working locally, working with your member of Congress, working with us. But if we're not all fighting every day for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, we risk losing that consensus and that support. So again, I'll just thank you in advance for everything that you'll do, and I look forward to either whether or not it's on Zoom coming back. I'm always happy to chat formally, informally, and hopefully one day actually making it back down to Savannah in person when it's safer and easier. So thank you.
And well, since we're about to finish, but I got one more question for you. The economic benefit to these countries with cooperative agreements is a great incentive, but for the average Arab citizen, do they fear reprisals from Arab groups from non-compliant Arab countries? I was going to finish, but I saw there's another question.
Is that in the chat? Let me take a look at that to make sure I
Yeah.
have the.
It is not it is in the chat for everyone.
Okay, good. So just to make sure do they fear reprisals just made from
Imagine
countries who aren't part of the agreements? Are some of the Arab countries or Arab states worried that other Arab countries will boycott them for working with Israel? Is that my understanding?
that sounds like what it's about. Or will there be terrorists attacking them? I think would be the other.
It's a good question. Again, I think for a lot of the states in the region, Iran is the #1 threat, and they worry more about what Iran is going to do in the region, from continuing to support the terrorist groups, sending weapons, really high-tech weapons to a lot of these rogue actors, as well as a nuclear program. So I don't think they're as so I don't think they're worried about the reprisals from the other groups. And I think for a lot of them, they're seeing that the benefits of working with Israel and having then obviously being able to work more closely with the United States as well, those benefits far outweigh the potential cost of some other countries saying, we're not going to work with you. And again, Israel has peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. Again, a lot of this wouldn't happen without the backing of the Saudis, U.A.E, Bahrain, a lot of these countries. So there really is a recognition that Israel's here to stay, and there's no reason not to have this collaboration moving forward. So, I can't speak to I really can't speak to how they're feeling, but I think the reason that they were willing to get involved so publicly and so deeply is because they recognize that the benefits far outweigh any costs.
Thank you very much. That was an incredible talk. Appreciate it. If you have any questions for Todd in the future, obviously he's at the Aipac office and you can catch them there. Next month on February 20th, we will interview Mayor Van Johnson, who of course has been mayor now for over a year. And so we're looking forward to talking with him. And I want to thank Todd Young again. We're going to send all of his 3 kids t-shirts and make a donation for you. I'll get the sizes and colors from you later. There'll be the awesome, of course, Shalom Y'all t-shirts, which are collector's items, obviously.
They love them. They love t-shirts, so they will gladly accept anything that.
Thank you very much. And again, Todd has been an incredible person and so easy to work with, so supportive. He comes, well, obviously before all this, he would come here if needed. We could go there, and he always is looking out for our needs. So thank you very much again. Give our best to your family. And again, thank you everybody for joining us. We'll see you on February 20th at 12:30, right after services, as we'll interview Mayor Johnson. And again, this will be on our YouTube channel for at least a couple of days, and then we will take it off per request. So thank you again, and I will get the position papers for you, and I'll send that to David. And if anybody else wants them, let me know as well. So from Congregation Mikveh Israel, Shabbat Shalom, stay safe.
Thank you.
And enjoy a really quiet week after 3 or 4 really loud ones. It'll be a very calm week for all of us. Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take
guys.
care, y'all.